The very first and so far only roller coaster that I've ever been on is a wooden roller coaster at the Kemah Boardwalk, known as the Boardwalk Bullet. At the age of 13, I stepped aboard this intimidating 96-foot-tall behemoth strapped in next to my dad and prepared myself for the thrill of a lifetime. True to the name of the attraction, we shot out at the boasted speed of over 50 miles per hour, and as the G's knocked my adolescent body backward, my mind started to wander. The chorus of cheers and screams from my fellow patrons faded away as I closed my eyes and thought about this guy. This little anthropomorphic bullet on the attraction's logo. What was his story? Does he have a family? Why is he so angry? Why is there a roller coaster devoted to him? Is there more to this ride? All of these questions raced through my brain as I white-knuckle gripped the safety bar in front of me and stared down at my feet, horrified and questioning not only why anyone finds this activity even remotely amusing, but also questioning the very lore of this ride itself. As I exited the ride in my pants that may or may not have been soiled, and proceeded to hurl the contents of my stomach into the nearest trash can, I came to a conclusion. The Boardwalk Bullet needs to have his story told, expanded upon, fleshed out, and what better medium to bring his story to life than cinema? I was determined to give this Boardwalk Bullet character, who I have just now decided is named Jeffrey, and his roller coaster, a feature film. Unfortunately, this dream never came to fruition because I was 13 and had no money, and also was only starting to understand that some ideas for movies just aren't very good. Now, if my idea seems completely insane to you, well, apparently several executives at the Walt Disney Company had the same idea that I did at 13, but had the one thing that I didn't have: the capital to back it up. What started in 1997 with Tower of Terror has since exploded into a phenomenon that at its best can bring in not only critical acclaim, but massive box office returns, and at its worst, some very boring critical and box office failures. In this video, I'm going to take a look into the strange world of theme park attraction film adaptations. Specifically those made by the Walt Disney Company, because there really aren't any other ones out there. It's a strange idea to want to turn a ride into a movie, and I have to figure out how I'm going to judge the films that I talk about in this video. As always, I'm going to look at them as individual works of art, but there's another angle to consider when something is an adaptation. We have to look at the source material and see just what was taken from the original property. The attractions at Walt Disney Resorts have a fan following all their own. Several of them are based upon their hit movies, but when Disneyland opened in Anaheim in 1955, it opened with original attractions that have their own, for lack of a better term, lore. Backstories that eager guests can decipher as they stand in line next to what at first sounds like a screaming 4-year-old, but is actually a 40-year-old mother of 3 who's filming the Cinderella actress for her Disney-themed TikTok page. I'm going to research each ride that the films were based off of and look at how faithful they were to them, as well as what they expanded upon and ultimately if it worked as an entertaining narrative or not. Not only do these films have to stand on their own as works of art, but by choosing to adapt something that offers the public exhilarating amusement, another question has to be considered. Does the film give you a similar experience to what you would feel while riding on the ride at a larger scale? Before I get into this, I want to give a huge shout out to all of the lovely people who have uploaded full ride POVs to YouTube. I will be crediting each of you. You are all amazing and you have helped me out incredibly with this video, since I can't currently afford to go to Disney World, and the last time I was there, I was like 2 years old and have no memory of it. The very first Disney movie to be based upon one of their theme park attractions was actually a TV movie that aired in 1997 on ABC called Tower of Terror. The ride, the Twilight Zone Tower of Terror, since opening in 1994 at Disney World, has remained one of the most popular rides in the theme park's history. Doing my research for this video, I was surprised to find that the original ride was only operating for 3 years before there was ever an adaptation of it. I always assumed that Tower of Terror was much older than it actually is, primarily due to its connection to Rod Serling's television series, The Twilight Zone. probably my favorite TV show of all time. While the movie has nothing to do with the Twilight Zone, the ride itself is almost based entirely around it, with a Rod Serling sound-alike narrator and the theme song playing as you enter the elevator. Although it doesn't feature a connection to the Twilight Zone, Tower of Terror is a very faithful adaptation of the attraction. Not only were some scenes actually filmed at the ride itself, but the backstory featured in the queue is kept exactly the same here, with the film just fleshing out a few details and giving the story an antagonist as well as a protagonist that I'll discuss right now. Steve Guttenberg plays a disgraced journalist who has resorted to writing for tabloids after losing his legitimate reporting job. He's approached by an old woman who informs him that a famous incident in 1939 at the Hollywood Tower Hotel, where 5 people mysteriously vanished in the elevator, is actually the result of a backfired witch's curse, and that there's proof of said curse in a book of spells hidden inside the hotel. Our protagonist, of course, plans to sensationalize the story by faking pictures of ghosts with his niece, played by a young Kirsten Dunst. But it's revealed that the curse is real, and the spirits of the 5 vanished people now haunt the hotel itself. I have vague memories of having seen this once on Disney Channel when I was growing up, but I was interested to see how effective the spooky atmosphere would be for me as an adult. The whole film is coated in this charming late 90s Halloween special vibe. I took note of how the whole thing feels like an extra long Goosebumps or Are You Afraid of the Dark episode. Upon further research, that connection actually makes a lot of sense, considering that it was directed by DJ McHale, one of the original creators of Are You Afraid of the Dark. His direction isn't half bad for a lower budget TV film. There are some fun shots of the interior of the hotel with some atmospheric lighting and plenty of Dutch angles. I'm a sucker for over-the-top spooky set design, and the filmmakers had a perfect reference to go off of from the ride itself. Steve Guttenberg gives a very committed performance here. The dialogue is a bit on the nose and no character talks like a real human being, but there's just something about the way that he lets himself have fun with it that transfers to the audience.
History's about to repeat itself. My niece is going along for the ride.
I also like the angle that this character is written from. In a lot of horror stories, we question why a character would put themselves into danger so often when dealing with a haunt, but when you have a character whose main goal is wanting to get rich and regain his journalism career, it makes sense that he would return to a haunted hotel over and over. It's definitely a campy movie, but in a way that works for when you're adapting something from a theme park ride. Subtlety isn't required. You want to give the audience what they paid for, and as far as being faithful to the Tower of Terror experience, I think this movie nails it. The 5 ghosts of the child actor, the singer, her boyfriend, the nanny, and the bellhop are portrayed exactly as they are in the attraction. And with the entire finale of the film being based around the elevator dropping, Tower of Terror just might be the most faithful to the ride out of every film that I'm going to talk about here. The story itself is pretty predictable, with a very obvious red herring setup that the nanny is implied to be the witch, when it's pretty obviously the old woman. The curse is literally broken with love at the end, so it's important to remember that this was on ABC and intended for a younger family audience. It has its corny moments here and there, but it was never boring. It takes me back to a time when TV channels would marathon Goosebumps and Are You Afraid of the Dark episodes around Halloween time. And while I definitely think some of those episodes were way scarier than this, I think the atmosphere and charm of Tower of Terror is effective enough for me to recommend it. They should definitely put this on Disney Plus, and I have no idea why it isn't on there already. There's an audience out there for this, and I hope one day that it's easily available to watch, because I think it's an important piece of history as the start of this weird era of Disney theme park ride adaptations. Not a bad start. Now, I had a bit of an issue with deciding on whether or not to include Mr. Toad's Wild Ride in this video. Technically, according to Wikipedia, this is the next filmed adaptation of a Disney attraction, but upon further research, that isn't actually true. This movie wasn't made with any intention of adapting Mr. Toad's Wild Ride. It was actually just a live-action adaptation of The Wind in the Willows, and that's even the title of the film in the UK. When Disney released the film here in the US, they changed the title to match the ride. Considering that this movie wasn't even intended to be based upon the attraction at all, I ultimately decided to skip it for this video and go straight into Oh man, this was a very boring movie to get through, and from the looks of it, the ride seemed pretty boring too. Originally opening as Rocket to the Moon and then Flight to the Moon before finally settling on Mission to Mars in the 70s, this attraction was less of a ride and more of a simulation experience. You would sit in this theater and look at some cool graphics while the seats would vibrate. I'm only going off of speculation that this ride just looked kinda boring because I have no way of ever trying it out for myself since it closed down in 1992. The film adaptation was released in 2000, 8 years after the ride had closed down. Yeah, I don't know why either. This is the only movie that took me 2 days to get through, by the way. I was so incredibly bored that I had to stop watching it and finish it a day later. Needless to say, I didn't care for this one at all, which is a real shame because it had some serious talent behind it. The plot revolves around a group of astronauts in the far-off future year of 2020, where an astronaut played by Don Cheadle loses contact with the space station after encountering an extraterrestrial being on Mars. A team of his friends is sent to rescue him, and I just don't care about any of them. There's nothing here for me to latch onto because the performances from everyone just fall flat. Tim Robbins, Gary Sinise, Connie Nielsen, Don Cheadle, composer Ennio Morricone, and director Brian De Palma all couldn't save this thing despite all of their individual talent. I think the main issue comes from the fact that we've seen space rescue mission movies like this done better both before and since. There's nothing about this one that stands out. With Gary Sinise talking about staying behind while his friend goes on a mission, all I could do was think about Apollo 13. If somebody was to walk in while you were watching this movie, they might actually think you were watching that instead. Hell, Apollo 13 came out in 1995 and had better visuals than this. There isn't even an attempt to show zero gravity as well as other films like this have. None of the dialogue feels natural. It's all too expository and cheesy. There are some scenes that are just unintentionally hilarious. Spoiler alert, I guess, but there's a scene where Tim Robbins takes his helmet off, sacrificing himself to keep his wife from dying, trying to rescue him, and something about the way this was executed just made me laugh. It reminded me of that one meme where Arnold from the Magic School Bus takes his helmet off. Yeah, this movie did nothing for me, and I really don't want to spend any more time on it, honestly. Writing this little blurb about it was very hard because I don't see anything worthy of expanding upon. I'm not angry about this movie, I just don't have anything to really rant about, nor do I have anything to praise. There's just nothing.
I love you.
Wait! Don't! Wait!
Yo! Yo, holy shit, he dead!
If you're going to make a movie based on a theme park ride, the worst thing you can do is make it boring. You messed up, De Palma. I still love you, though. The next movie also wasn't based on a ride, but a show. A much more entertaining and memorable show at that. At first glance, the Country Bear Jamboree seems like it has the most solid foundation out of all of the attractions for an adaptation that focuses on actual characters and not just recognizable elements from a ride. That's because it's not a ride. It's a stage show where animatronic animals perform old-school country music hits in Country Bear Hall, where there's a little bit of backstory sprinkled throughout. It's a cute experience with talking mounted animal heads and an impressively executed showcase of animatronics. I can actually see somebody taking this concept and turning it into a pretty decent film, especially if it's a self-aware parody of these kinds of legendary bands. At first, that's what the Country Bears seems to be, and I was on board with the whole thing for the first few minutes. I like the idea of using these anthropomorphic animals to lampoon real-life band documentaries that often come across as self-indulgent or overly sanitized to protect the band's image. This movie could have worked as a kid's This Is Spinal Tap, but unfortunately, the Country Bears really falls off once the actual story starts a few minutes in. The movie squanders any potential it might have had to become a basic road trip movie with unfunny jokes, bland characters, out-of-place celebrity cameos, and musical sequences that only appear to happen to boost the artists signed to Disney's label. The plot revolves around a young bear who is a massive fan of the now broken up Country Bears. After visiting Country Bear Hall and learning that it's going to be torn down, he resolves to get the band back together for a reunion performance to raise the money to save the venue. What the Country Bears is trying its hardest to be with its random musical sequences, celebrity cameos, and cartoonish human performances is one of the classic Muppet movies. As a matter of fact, as I'm sure you've probably noticed by now, the plot is almost identical to the 2011 Muppet movie. Where that film worked and this failed was in its ability to be tongue-in-cheek and still have some genuine character shine through, in the main Muppet character of Walter. The songs were way more memorable, the celebrities felt like amped up versions of themselves, and the jokes were actually funny. The Country Bears just doesn't have the emotional weight necessary to have me invested in these characters, and spends way too much time attempting to be sincere while failing to be funny. The only thing that I truly laughed at was the performance of Christopher Walken as the villain. I'm not sure if he didn't understand what movie he was in or completely understood, but either way, his line deliveries are so odd that I couldn't help but chuckle. I also laughed when Elizabeth pointed out to me that one of the bears reminds them of my dad. Yeah, I get it. As far as being faithful to the ride, it does feature bears that perform country music, so I guess you could say it's somewhat faithful. I think it lacks the charm of the ride though. I think diehard fans would also point out that the personalities of the bears aren't really the same as the show. The cartoony nature of the characters isn't preserved, and it makes them so much more boring and unlikable. I really do wish that this one was better because I see a promising premise hidden in here. What at first seems to be a satirical take on the rise, fall, and reunion of legendary musical acts only becomes another generic story of one, but with bears. Very well-crafted bears designed by some seriously talented artists, mind you, but just boring bears nonetheless. I want to give credit where it's due. These animatronic suits are excellent. They're able to show a good amount of emotion and never come across as creepy to me when they easily could have. There was some serious talent behind these costumes. I want to be clear that I'm more disappointed in this movie than bored or angered by it. It's a mediocre movie that I feel could have been so much more. Before I move on to the next movie, I want to acknowledge that, as with all movies that I may express any negative opinions on this channel, there do exist fans of the Country Bears. One of them just so happens to be my best friend Elizabeth, who rewatched this movie with me for this video. I have been given a prepared statement to read here on camera, written by Elizabeth in defense of this movie. I am actually afraid that if I don't do this, I will be physically harmed. The plot of the Country Bears is pretty average, but what it lacks in story, it makes up for with everything else. Starting off with the insane amount of guest stars / cameos. Elton John, Queen Latifah, Willie Nelson, and Bonnie Raitt, to name a few. Because they have all these musical guests, the soundtrack is a flipping banger. I don't even listen to country music and I like it. The best part about this movie is the costumes. Those bear costumes are the best costumes I've seen in movies, pretty much ever. And because they went so hard on those costumes, it makes the movie feel so over the top and campy in the best way, and I can't help but love it. I wish I could have gone to the Country Bear Jamboree, even though I know those animatronics were scary looking. Thank you, Elizabeth. So far, Disney attraction adaptations have gotten off to a rocky start. After a decent TV movie, Disney had released 2 adaptations that were both critical and commercial failures. It's hard to imagine that they were all too enthusiastic about the next idea to adapt one of their classic rides to the big screen. And I'm sure that Gore Verbinski was feeling the pressure when he sat in the director's chair for a big budget epic that was to be based on one of the most beloved rides in Disney park history. I don't think anyone was prepared for the absolute juggernaut of a film franchise that would come from. Needless to say at this point, but Pirates of the Caribbean would become a global phenomenon after Curse of the Black Pearl hit theaters in 2003. Not only is it an anomaly to have such a massively successful property based on a theme park ride, but it's safe to say that at this point, the Pirates franchise is more recognized today as a film series than as a theme park attraction. The movies are so massive, they've actually eclipsed the original ride. I have a lot to say about this entire franchise, and I'll be touching upon several elements from the sequels in this video, but I want to save a more in-depth discussion of the whole series for a potential future video. There's simply so much to talk about if we look at the narrative of the entire series, but I want to really focus on that first film and how it beat the odds. When it was first announced, it seemed like it had everything going against it. These types of movies had a history of flopping at the box office, and I don't just mean ride-based movies either. Swashbucklers had been on the decline for decades, with few notable hits popping up that would justify spending millions filming on the high seas with large practical ships, extravagant sets, and tons of extras. Disney CEO Michael Eisner even tried to shut down that first Pirates film after the commercial failure of The Country Bears, believing that this type of movie was just
box office poison.
Luckily, The Curse of the Black Pearl had some undeniably devoted people working on it. Producer Jerry Bruckheimer insisted upon the high budget to compete with other series like Lord of the Rings and The Matrix, and director Gore Verbinski truly believed in this project. He wanted to make something great, something that could succeed in expanding upon such a simple premise. I think part of the reason why this first film works so well is because of how much room the ride left for growth. There's not exactly a very intricate story to the original ride. You've got a bunch of pirates running amok, the skeletal remains of swashbucklers left behind, the iconic song A Pirate's Life for Me, and the group of pirate prisoners trying to get the keys to their cell from a dog. Every single one of those elements is featured in this movie, and with plenty of screen time left to do what every other film before it had struggled to do. Tell a compelling story in a world with a fascinating lore, starring one of the most iconic characters in all of cinema. Easier said than done, but they managed to pull it off. Pirates of the Caribbean: The Curse of the Black Pearl is a fantastic film. It's the best movie that I'm going to talk about in this video, and the best film of its franchise in my opinion. Director Gore Verbinski and screenwriters Ted Elliott and Terry Rossio deserve all the praise for making this insane concept work. They managed to look at a bunch of lifeless skeletons in a dark ride and somehow turn that into a story of cursed Aztec gold that damns a crew of greedy pirates to immortality for stealing it, revealing their true lifeless forms under the pale moonlight. They combined an action-packed, funny swashbuckler with a 1940s horror film. The shot of the skeleton pirates walking across the bottom of the ocean is such a powerful image. This alone could have sold that first movie, and it certainly helped, but it was the characters that made us keep coming back. I'm not sure how much I can add to this conversation, but it bears repeating that Johnny Depp's Oscar-nominated portrayal of Jack Sparrow,
Captain Jack Sparrow,
is still a brilliant display of complete originality. This character works on so many levels, but what makes him so compelling to me is that we don't really know too much about him. He's a pirate whose very name elicits laughter, scorn, respect, admiration, and even fear in so many, but we aren't ever fully told why. Will and Elizabeth are given backstories. They're caught up in this crazy adventure, and Jack acts as a sort of guide through it. The genius of this character is that it's never made clear if he himself is a genius or just extremely lucky. The answer is probably both, but it makes him so thrilling to watch. You just can't take your eyes off him when he's on screen. As much as depth threatens to overshadow everybody else, we can't ignore Geoffrey Rush as Barbossa either. I just love when you can tell how much fun an actor is having with the role they're playing. Depp and Rush absolutely killed it in not just this film, but the next two that would follow it. That original Pirates trilogy was huge, man. I remember being so hyped for Dead Man's Chest, and apparently so was everyone else, because it was one of the highest grossing films of all time upon release, and the highest grossing film of that year. Again, I don't want to spend too much time on the rest of the series because it really started to become its own beast at this point. Moving away from the original ride that it's based upon, Dead Man's Chest and At World's End are f***ing awesome movies. They get a little bloated here and there, and the lore can be a bit complicated at times, but there's just so much imagination that I can't help but give it some respect. They could have doubled down and just made the same movie again, but they didn't. They chose to keep pushing these movies further and further, breaking new ground with each release for a while. The soundtrack basically became what pirates sound like in popular culture now. The massive action sequences impacted how blockbusters would be made from now on, and the special effects. Holy shit. The skeleton pirates still hold up from that first film, but we can't not mention how unbelievable Davy Jones still looks to this very day. This was 2006, and we have movies coming out aided by the technology of today that can't reach this level of detail. There was passion here. There was imagination here. I love these three movies, but unfortunately I can't say the same for the next two. I think part of the reason why Pirates fell apart is, ironically, for the same reason it did so well. As each film made more and more money, the pop culture status of Jack Sparrow started to force him more into the limelight. Where at first he felt like a mysterious stranger going on his own journey, he quickly became the sole focus of the story. And the Flanderization hit him very hard. Where it used to be a mystery as to whether Jack was stupid or cunning, by the last film, it really seems like the writers saw this character as a lovable idiot that wins by pure luck and doesn't care about anyone. Jack could be cutthroat in the first three and betray others to meet his own needs, but those small glimpses of humanity endeared us to him. By the last films, he just becomes unlikable. The antagonists also never reached the greatness of Barbossa or Davy Jones either. Sadly, I think this franchise is dead in the water, especially since there's talks of a reboot. As unfortunate as that may be, I'm very glad that the Pirates franchise exists and that I got to see it at its very best as they were coming out. Similar to the Country Bears, I've got to give a shout out to someone else who loves these movies. I can't wait to rewatch this series with you again, Dad. If you're interested in seeing me dive deeper into this entire franchise in a future video, let me know in the comments. The very same year as the first Pirates movie, audiences were treated to a return to the roots of these adaptations, with another spooky ride movie. A ride that's probably the most beloved out of every single attraction Disney has ever put out. Hey, ignore that everything looks different right now and that it's dark outside. My camera messed up and the entire rest of that entire video that I shot went out of focus, so I'm doing it again. Bear with me. I think my opinion on the 2003 Haunted Mansion film has fluctuated the most out of any movie I'm going to talk about in this video. As a kid, I remember really liking this movie. I loved Eddie Murphy, I found the singing busts hilarious, and I loved the spooky visuals. When I came back to the film years later, however, I really didn't like it. There was just something about it that didn't click when I got older, and I dreaded coming back to it again for this video because I was worried that it would only get worse, as it seemed to when I revisited it before. Interestingly enough though, watching it for this video, I've kind of regained some of that respect that I had for it when I was a kid, while also still being able to acknowledge its many faults, because it certainly isn't perfect. The actual ride is one of Disney's most celebrated, and I think it's the go-to example if you want to describe to someone what a ride at one of these theme parks is like. It has an iconic queue that gives you some backstory and entertainment while you wait for the ride, which takes you on a journey through a spooky mansion and a graveyard that show off some still insanely impressive animatronic and visual tricks. I think what they nailed when crafting this ride is how the concept of a haunted house can be both scary and fun at the same time, and I really have to give it to director Rob Minkoff for trying to capture that energy for this movie. In some ways it succeeds, and in others it sadly falls short. Our protagonists are a married couple who work in real estate and get a call to check out a mansion on their way to a lake for the weekend. The whole family is forced to stay the night in the mansion due to the weather, and the mysteries of the supernatural occurrences are revealed to them. I think the Haunted Mansion works best when it's recreating moments from the ride and showing off its impressive special effects, costumes, makeup, and set design. I love the way that the titular mansion looks here. Similar to Tower of Terror, there's a delightful campiness to the way that everything is designed. There's cobwebs everywhere, everything is lit by candlelight, there's an absurdly large cemetery with a giant mausoleum on the property. Even though they didn't film at the actual location of the ride like Tower of Terror, this feels like something you would see at a Disney theme park. Visually, I think this movie is excellent. The legendary Rick Baker did the special effects makeup and costumes for all of the ghosts, and I think he knocked it out of the park. As we'll explore later in this video, nowadays a lot of this would have been done with CGI, but the way that the ghosts were done here is with practical makeup and compositing to give them that blue, otherworldly look. When you combine good practical makeup and digital effects, you get results that can stand the test of time, even if some of the CG on its own doesn't exactly age perfectly. I appreciate that a lot of the visuals here are genuinely intense, despite the marketing toward families. Even though the ghosts are pretty silly looking, the zombies in the mausoleum look as great as any other monster designed by Rick Baker. This scene isn't played for laughs as much as the others and introduces some real stakes after such a lighthearted jaunt through the cemetery. It helps to sell that this family is in real danger without going too far with the gore or violence. In terms of adapting the ride, just about everything that you'd recognize is here. Grim Grinning Ghosts is sung, the cemetery sequence is full of references to characters from the ride, there are levitating objects, Madame Leota, and there's a heavy amount of dialogue lifted directly from the attraction. Aesthetically, there's a lot to praise here, but unfortunately the film really suffers in the story and character department. I just don't find myself attached to this family at all. A lot of that has to do with the performances. The kids get on my nerves, and the mom has by far the weakest performance in the film, which is odd because she's the only member of the family that has any real connection to the events happening in the mansion. The ghosts lured her there because the master of the mansion needs to marry her in order to move on to the afterlife because she resembles his lost love who took her own life. This part of the story really drags every single time they cut to it. The opening title sequence gave us the whole backstory already, but so much time is devoted to this ghost explaining to the mom something we already know. There isn't a whole lot of new information conveyed here to justify it taking up so much of the runtime, especially since everything else that's happening is so much more entertaining. Eddie Murphy is as charismatic as he usually is, and while I don't care for his character all that much, I can't help but enjoy his performance. He seems to be having a lot of fun with the material that he's been given. The performances that work the absolute best come from all of the accomplished character actors playing the actual ghosts. Wallace Shawn, Dina Spivey, Jennifer Tilly, and especially Terrence Stamp as the main antagonist. This man is the definition of understanding the assignment. He knows exactly what movie he's in and plays this character as over the top as he deserves to be played. It's hilarious.
My name is Ramsley.
Speaking of hilarious, hands down, the best scene in the movie is with the singing busts. It perfectly captures the energy of the haunted mansion in just a few minutes and still gets a laugh out of me and my family to this very day.
She'll be coming round the mountain when she comes, she'll be coming round the mountain when she comes. Listen, guys.
I want to like this movie a lot more, but I just can't get invested in any of these characters, and it almost seems like the movie itself can't get invested in them either. They don't really have that much to do with what's going on in the mansion. The mom is the only character that really needs to be there for the plot to advance. Everybody else is used to move from one scare to the next. It's also pretty obvious where the story is going from the moment it begins. Yeah, the butler did it. He poisoned the master's fiance, and after that's revealed, he's dragged to hell for no real reason. It's not really explained why this happens. It kind of comes out of nowhere, almost like the writers didn't really know how to have the family defeat this ghost, so God did it, I guess. As weak as the story may be, I actually came to an interesting conclusion while watching it again. This movie perfectly captures what it's like to ride one of these rides. The family shows up to the mansion, sees some spooky stuff, doesn't have a whole lot to do but react to it, and leaves with souvenirs. It's a movie that knows exactly what it is, and while I can't call it a good movie, it certainly isn't worthless. This is the only ride in this entire video that actually has another adaptation, so we'll see just how the two compare later. After the Haunted Mansion, Disney really focused on more Pirates of the Caribbean sequels for a few years, and it wouldn't be until 2015 that we got another one of these adaptations. One not based on a single ride or attraction itself, but based on one of the park's lands, entitled The original idea behind Tomorrowland was to give people glimpses into Disney's view of the world of tomorrow. This belief in human creativity and ingenuity that would lead us toward a brighter future is where the retro-futuristic design of Tomorrowland came from. It's not a single ride or attraction or show, but an entire section of the park devoted to this optimism that was intended to fascinate and inspire the next generation of creators. Director Brad Bird and writer Damon Lindelof both wanted to capture the message of Tomorrowland in their film, but unfortunately it just didn't stick. This movie really disappointed me because I happen to be a huge fan of Brad Bird. The Incredibles, Ratatouille, and The Iron Giant were given to us by Brad Bird, and he's proven himself to be a gifted live-action director as well, with Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol under his belt. In a way, he seems like the perfect choice to adapt a film with this very retro 50s Americana belief system, considering he nailed that aesthetic so well in The Iron Giant. Where Tomorrowland fails is that despite preaching about innovation, it just feels so conventional. Nothing about it is anything we haven't seen done better before, both visually and narratively. The titular Tomorrowland is this futuristic secret utopia where dreamers gather to invent new technologies to better our regular world. And in the modern day, a teenager is invited to Tomorrowland to save our world from destruction because she's an optimist and the only one that has the determination to inspire others, even the jaded George Clooney, who was banished from Tomorrowland decades ago, and has since given up on the future, and yeah, it's just a boring movie. Tomorrowland is only actually featured in flashbacks and in the last 30 minutes of the movie, where it's almost entirely relegated to this one platform. We don't see any cool technology or anything that looks even remotely real because we've officially stopped building actual sets in movies for some reason, and now we just green screen everything. The CG is painfully unconvincing here. I can't really discuss faithfulness to the original attraction for too long because it's not based on one specific ride. With that said, the majority of the movie takes place in our regular, boring, modern-day world, so there's nothing to recognize or latch onto if you're a big Tomorrowland fan. The ideas that Tomorrowland presents is more what this movie is trying to adapt, but that's not enough to carry a movie on its own. You have to have a good story and characters, and it fails there too. I can't get attached to a single person in this film. The performances are either trying way too hard, or in the case of George Clooney, aren't trying at all. Seriously, I know this character is supposed to be annoyed and jaded, but even in the moments where he is supposed to reclaim his optimism, Clooney looks like he'd rather be anywhere else but in this movie. I'm really struggling to find something to say about Tomorrowland other than that it's boring and generic, but it just is. If I didn't have the Wikipedia page open next to me, I'd be lost because I have actually forgotten the majority of what happens here. The only thing that I find remotely amusing about this movie is that its primary theme is built around being original and creative, despite being produced by modern-day Disney, who at this point seems to have completely given up on doing anything original or creative. Actually, you know what movie had the same futurist philosophy, retro design, and an actually cool vision of the world of tomorrow? Meet the Robinsons. This movie came out in 2007 and does everything that Tomorrowland wants to do infinitely better. Its message is more powerful and effective, its characters are more lovable, its world more imaginative. Tomorrowland is so boring that I'm thinking about rewatching Meet the Robinsons again. Damn, I need to put that on after I film this. As I said when talking about Mission to Mars, the worst thing that a movie based on something designed to give you a sense of amusement can be is boring. Tomorrowland is a serious disappointment to me. I wish nothing but the best for Brad Bird. I know he has a serious amount of talent, and I hope that this is just a stumble on his journey as a director, because I'll definitely be there for the next thing that he makes. Sadly, this just wasn't it, and at the risk of spoiling the rest of this video, it doesn't get much better from here. Conceptually, Jungle Cruise doesn't seem like the worst ride to make a movie out of. If you get the right cast, the right director, and know how to craft some exciting jungle-themed action sequences in some really cool exotic locations, you can really make something thrilling. Sadly, we have officially caught up to the 2020s, where every single Disney film now looks like it is made by the exact same team with no passion or energy behind it, featuring special effects that not only look terrible, but are completely unnecessary, as this movie cost $200 million to make, and you couldn't film one scene in an actual jungle. $200 million and you couldn't build one convincing set that resembles a real exotic location. $200 million and the CGI looks so terrible that you cover most of it in darkness just to try and hide how bad it looks. $200 million and you couldn't get anything out of this script that, by the way, is just Stephen Sommers' The Mummy. Seriously, a British brother and sister acquire a map to an ancient treasure in an exotic location and need an experienced guide who also has a history with said location to lead them there, where they do battle with the undead who are placed under a curse. It's The Mummy, but seriously lacking any of the charm that made The Mummy great. What sucks the most is that I've been missing the kinds of adventure films that Jungle Cruise is trying to be, but none of the craft that goes into making an effective adventure film is on display here. You can almost feel Emily Blunt and Jesse Plemons trying their best to inject some life into this script, but their performances just can't save it. Hell, Paul Giamatti is in this movie for like 3 minutes, and he was more interesting than Dwayne Johnson. Oh, Dwayne Johnson, how I have tired of seeing you in everything. This just isn't the role for you, man. You don't have the energy nor the comedic timing needed to make anything they're trying to write for you work. The movie tries to convince you that Johnson and Blunt are forming some romantic attachment, but they just have zero chemistry together. Although it was hard for me to focus on that lack of chemistry when the editing in these dialogue sequences was just so horrendous. Truly, I have no idea why there are so many cuts when characters are just talking and not any cuts in the action sequences where they would be more appropriate. It's like they got the basics of filmmaking just completely wrong here, something becoming more and more common in mainstream releases these days. Everything just looks so artificial and lifeless. Just because you can green screen somebody into a crazy location or animate a photorealistic jaguar doesn't mean that it's going to help you tell an effective story. It's also just way too long. There's a reveal about Johnson's character that occurs near the last 20 minutes that has little to no effect on the actual story at all. Honestly, Johnson himself feels like he has no real effect on this film. He just sticks out so badly. This is not a Dwayne Johnson movie. As far as faithfulness to the ride is concerned, they kinda recreate it in his first scene with a few references, but overall, the story really has nothing to do with it. We've officially entered the era where these films are more obsessed with expanding the Disney brand and proposing the start of a franchise than giving you a memorable experience. They had already announced a sequel to this thing days after it was released, probably hoping to recapture the lightning in a bottle that was Pirates of the Caribbean. You can't recreate what Pirates did, no matter how much you attempt to imitate it. Wouldn't it have been cool if there were no supernatural elements to this story? What if it really was just about adventurers trying to be the first to get to a treasure buried deep in the Amazon? With how little the ride has to offer in the way of story, you could have done something unique. But I guess 4 writers couldn't come up with anything more than a Mummy and Pirates of the Caribbean ripoff. Be your own thing, Jungle Cruise. Considering what Disney is putting out these days, simply wanting some small amount of originality is apparently demanding way too much. In terms of good things about it, the movie does feature a pretty cool version of Metallica's Nothing Else Matters, composed by the genius James Newton Howard. I'm not sure why it's here, but I do like listening to it. It's not the worst movie I've ever seen, nor is it a complete disaster, but I'd rather watch a complete disaster. That at least would have been more memorable than this mediocre time waster that blends right in with everything else this company is putting out these days. With all that said, we have come to the most recent adaptation of a Disney attraction and the second to be based off of Where the 2003 Haunted Mansion's primary focus was to give us an experience that felt similar to the attraction, not focusing too much on character or plot, the 2023 version has the exact opposite goal. It takes itself way too seriously to be any fun, and despite having a very talented cast, none of them are able to do anything to salvage the material they've been given. In some ways, the movie tries to incorporate more elements of the ride, mainly expanding the role of the iconic Hatbox Ghost to antagonist and playing with the idea that the ghosts can follow you home after visiting the mansion, but there's just none of that campy charm of the ride or even the 2003 movie. The first attempt wasn't perfect, but at least that movie had a cool looking mansion, and once the characters got there, everything became about showing off the Haunted Mansion. Here, they spend so much time running around outside of the mansion trying to solve an uninteresting mystery about a boring antagonist. It seems like the movie forgot that it was even based on the ride. I'm struggling to remember just how much of the iconography from the attraction is even here. Madame Leota and the Hatbox Ghost have a significant presence, but what about the singing busts, man? Come on, how could you not include them? It doesn't help that the craftsmanship on display in the 03 version is just completely gone here. The production design isn't nearly as visually interesting. It's like this movie was trying its best not to be fun. I'm not against the idea of trying to flesh out these characters. That's actually one of the biggest issues that I had with the 03 version, but there has to be a healthy balance. So much time is spent on these people that I just don't care about that every dialogue scene I was just waiting for something spooky to happen. None of the imagery is even remotely scary or intense. It's way too sanitized. Like Jungle Cruise, it just feels like another product pushed out by a company that just doesn't care anymore. What's interesting is that there was another Haunted Mansion film in development hell for years before this one that was to be directed by Guillermo del Toro. Maybe in the good timeline we could have gotten that one. We were robbed. Haunted Mansion 2023 is just another example of what the House of Mouse puts out every year now. A cheap collection of references for diehard fans that they hope will turn a profit and keep their brand alive. I know I haven't said a lot about this one in comparison to the other movies I've talked about here, but there really isn't much to say. It's just a bad movie. And so we have reached the end of our journey through these adaptations so far. But Disney isn't done making these movies just yet. There are a few confirmed adaptations on the way. A sixth Pirates of the Caribbean film is being made, and I'm not sure if it's a reboot or a sequel at this point. The roller coaster Space Mountain is getting an adaptation. Interestingly, Tower of Terror is getting another adaptation set to be produced by and star Scarlett Johansson. Jungle Cruise is reportedly getting that sequel still. Big Thunder Mountain Railroad is another roller coaster that's going to get a movie. And Seth Rogen is producing an adaptation entitled Figment based on the Journey into Imagination attraction. It's interesting to see how the original rides have since been affected by their adaptations. Pirates of the Caribbean has incorporated characters from the film permanently into the attraction, forever securing their entwined legacy. Other than Pirates, though, the rest of these attractions have either since closed down or continued to grow strong without ever really having to acknowledge their movie counterparts. Haunted Mansion, Jungle Cruise, and Tomorrowland have been and will continue to remain popular despite the success or failure of their movies because they provide amusement to so many. It's easy to look at Pirates of the Caribbean as a lightning in a bottle phenomenon, but I don't think it's impossible to make another great movie based on a ride. Great films can come from any source material. You just have to have talented artists at the helm who remember that the entire point of a theme park attraction is to have fun. Capture the spirit and energy of what it's like to experience one of these rides, include some memorable characters, and there's no reason why you can't have another success like Pirates, or even just a decent time like Tower of Terror or the 2003 Haunted Mansion. It seems like every mainstream film that gets released now is either an adaptation, sequel, reboot, or remake of an already popular property. If we're going to keep going down this path until mainstream audiences just finally stop paying to see them, the least we can do is inject some life back into this fun concept. As silly of an idea as it is to want to make a movie based off of a ride, it has worked before and it can work again. Only time will tell when or if it does. Thanks for going on this journey with me, ladies and gentlemen. Please wait until the ride has come to a complete stop before exiting through our gift shop, where you can pick up your membership to my Patreon, which will give you access to my Discord server and other special rewards like early access to videos, behind the scenes videos, and other exclusive content. Thank you so much to my beautiful patrons for supporting me, and a very special shout out to my first ever executive producer patron, Lapis Lazuli VA. Your support means the world to me. I've loved chatting with you on Discord. Thank you all so much. I hope that this video was fun for all of you. Leave me a comment down below on what you thought of the movies that I talked about, what ride you'd like to see adapted into a movie, and if you'd like to see me cover the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise in a future video. You're all the best. Thank you so much for watching my videos and coming back to my channel. I will see you in the next video. Let's get that Boardwalk Bullet movie made. Take care, everybody.